The high school parking lot was a chaotic mess. Cars honked impatiently, students streamed out of the building in noisy clusters, and parents in SUVs tried to maneuver through the crowded lanes. But amidst the bustle, one car stood out, a rusted blue sedan parked crookedly near the edge of the lot. Its engine was off, but the keys were still dangling from the ignition. The windows were rolled down, and the afternoon breeze rustled the loose papers spilling from a backpack on the passenger seat. Detective Maya Reyes stepped out of her unmarked car, her sharp brown eyes immediately catching the strangeness of the scene. She had seen enough missing persons cases to know that something was off. This wasn't just a kid skipping school or running away. Something darker was at play here. Maya had been working with the local police department for only 3 years, but her instincts were razor sharp. She approached the car slowly, scanning the surrounding area. A group of teachers stood nearby, their faces etched with concern. One of them, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a wrinkled shirt, stepped forward. "Detective Reyes," he asked, his voice tight and trembling. "I'm Mr. Harrison. I called it in. It's about Ethan. Ethan Carter." Reyes nodded, pulling out a small notepad. "What can you tell me about Ethan?" Harrison ran a hand through his hair, clearly rattled. "He's one of my students. 16 years old. Quiet kid, artistic, a bit of a loner. He didn't show up to my last class today, and when I went looking for him, I found his car like this. He's never done anything like this before. It's not like him." Reyes stepped closer to the car, peering through the open window. The backpack was unzipped, revealing sketchbooks and loose pencils inside. She opened the door carefully, slipping on a pair of gloves before picking up a notebook. Flipping through it, she paused on one page. A peculiar drawing caught her eye, a symbol that looked like a combination of a spiral and an eye. It was intricate, almost hypnotic. She didn't recognize it, but something about it unsettled her. Did Ethan mention anything unusual recently? Any conflicts with other students? Problems at home? She asked. Harrison shook his head. No, nothing like that. He was quiet, but not troubled. If anything, he spent most of his time in the library. He was close to Mrs. Walker, our librarian. Maybe she knows something? Reyes nodded, tucking the sketchbook under her arm. I'll need to speak with her. In the meantime, let me know if you think of anything else. The library was dimly lit when Reyes arrived, the fluorescent bulbs casting a faint yellow glow over rows of neatly shelved books. Mrs. Walker, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a warm smile, was tidying up behind the counter. When Reyes introduced herself, the librarian's expression shifted to one of concern. Ethan? Oh no, has something happened? Reyes gestured to the sketchbook. He's missing. I found this in his car. Mr. Harrison mentioned that Ethan spent a lot of time here. Can you tell me anything about him? Walker's face softened. Ethan's a wonderful boy. Very curious, very bright. He loved old mythology. He was always checking out books on legends and folklore, especially anything local. Recently, he was fascinated by stories about the tunnels beneath the city. The tunnels? Reyes asked, intrigued. Yes, Walker said, moving to her computer. There's an old legend about them. Supposedly, they were used for smuggling during Prohibition, but some people believe they go back even further. Ethan was researching them for weeks. He even showed me some of his drawings, symbols like the one in his sketchbook. He said they were connected to the tunnels somehow. Walker pulled up an image on her screen. It was the same symbol Reyes had seen in the sketchbook. Her unease deepened. Do you know where he might have gone to look for these tunnels? Reyes asked. Walker shook her head. I'm sorry. He never mentioned anything specific. But he was convinced they were real. Back at the precinct, Reyes sat at her desk, the image of the symbol on her computer screen. She ran it through the department's database, searching for any connections. After several minutes, a match popped up. It was a variation of an emblem associated with an urban legend about a secret society called the Silent Ones. According to the file, the Silent Ones were rumored to have controlled the city from the shadows for decades, using the tunnels as their base of operations. The legend was old, almost forgotten, but the details were chilling. Reyes leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far from clear. She ordered a full background check on the legend, determined to uncover the truth. If the Silent Ones were more than just a story, then Ethan might be in serious danger. The next morning, Reyes met with a local historian named Dr. Evelyn Marks. They sat in a small office cluttered with books and papers, the air thick with the smell of old parchment. "The tunnels are real," Marks confirmed, adjusting her glasses. "They were used for smuggling, but there's evidence they're much older. Some believe they were built by a group seeking to control the city from beneath. The Silent Ones, they called themselves." Reyes leaned forward. "And these Silent Ones, what do you know about them?" Marks hesitated, her expression darkening. "Not much, I'm afraid. The stories are vague, but they all say the same thing: the Silent Ones never left the tunnels. They're still down there, waiting." A chill ran down Reyes' spine. "Do you think Ethan's disappearance could be connected to the tunnels?" "It's possible," Mark said. "If he was looking for them, he might have found something, or someone, he wasn't supposed to." Reyes left the historian's office with a sinking feeling. She had her team check for any recent activity near the tunnels, but the reports came back inconclusive. Frustrated but undeterred, she dug deeper into the files on the Silent Ones. One name kept appearing: Silas Hawthorne, the CEO of a major construction company currently expanding the city's underground infrastructure. Hawthorne's name had also been linked to the old legends, though the connections were tenuous at best. Reyes decided to pay a visit to the construction site. It was late when she arrived, the site deserted for the night. The towering cranes and half-built structures cast long shadows under the moonlight. She moved cautiously, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Near the back of the site, she found a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." It was ajar. Inside, the air was damp and cold. Reyes followed a narrow corridor that led to a supply closet. But when she opened the door, she found more than just cleaning supplies. A hidden staircase spiraled downward, its steps disappearing into the shadows. Her gut told her she was on the right track. The air grew colder as she descended, the walls narrowing around her. At the bottom, she found herself in a network of tunnels, their stone walls slick with moisture. Her footsteps echoed as she moved forward, her hand resting on the grip of her gun. The faint sound of dripping water filled the air, and ahead, a flickering light illuminated the path. Reyes followed the light to a large cavern. The walls were covered in carvings, the same symbol from Ethan's sketchbook etched into the stone. In the center of the room, she found a cell phone lying on the ground. Picking it up, she saw that it was Ethan's. Her heart raced. She was close. "Detective Reyes," a voice said behind her, cold and commanding. She spun around, her gun drawn. A man stepped out of the shadows, his figure tall and imposing. He wore a tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back, and his eyes gleamed with a chilling confidence. "You've come far," he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But I'm afraid this is where your journey ends." "Silas Hawthorne," Reyes said, her voice steady. "Where's Ethan?" Hawthorne chuckled. "Ethan served his purpose. He helped us find what we were looking for." "The artifact?" Reyes guessed, her mind racing. Hawthorne's smile widened. "Ah, so you've done your homework." "Yes, the artifact. It's more than just a relic. It's the key to our future, a future where the Silent Ones reclaim their rightful place." Reyes tightened her grip on her gun. "You're insane." "Am I?" Hawthorne said, stepping closer. "Or have I simply embraced the truth? We've been watching you, detective. Your connection to the missing children, it made you the perfect candidate for our little test." Reyes felt a surge of anger. You used Ethan to lure me here. Indeed, Hawthorne said. And now, you have a choice. Join us, or disappear like the others. Reyes's mind raced. She needed to buy time. What does the artifact do? Hawthorne's expression darkened. It brings order. Power. It unites those who live in the shadows. With it, we will control everything. Reyes took a step back, her mind racing. She had to find a way to stop him. But before she could act, Hawthorne raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The cavern erupted into chaos as Reyes dove for cover. She fired her weapon, taking down 2 of Hawthorne's guards. The sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels as more men poured into the room. Reyes moved quickly, using the shadows to her advantage. She spotted Hawthorne near the back of the cavern, the artifact in his hand. It was a small stone carving, intricate and ancient. Reyes knew she couldn't let him escape with it. She charged toward him, her determination overpowering her fear. Hawthorne turned to face her, his eyes filled with fury. You should have joined us, Maya. You could have been great. Reyes didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, disarming him with a swift move. They grappled, their struggle fierce and desperate. Finally, Reyes managed to pin him, her gun pressed against his chest. It's over, she said, her voice firm. Hawthorne laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. You'll never stop us. The Silent Ones are eternal. Reyes pulled the trigger. Hawthorne collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a thud. For a moment, the cavern was silent. Then, Reyes heard a faint sound, a voice calling out. She turned and saw Ethan, huddled in a corner, his face pale and terrified. She ran to him, pulling him into a tight embrace. You're safe now, she whispered. It's over. As they emerged from the tunnels, the first rays of dawn broke over the city. Reyes knew the fight wasn't truly over. The Silent Ones might be weakened, but they weren't gone. Still, for now, she had won. Ethan was safe, and justice had been served. Back at the precinct, Reyes reviewed the files she had recovered. The Silent Ones' network was vast, their influence deep. But she was ready. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And as she picked up a new case file, a missing girl, she knew her fight was far from finished. The shadows still held secrets, but she was determined to bring them into the light. Reyes sat at her desk, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. The precinct buzzed with activity, incoming calls, the clatter of keyboards, the shuffle of officers moving between desks, but it all felt distant, like she was underwater. The artifact, now secured in a locked evidence box deep within the department's archives, haunted her thoughts. She had barely slept since the tunnels. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the carvings on the walls, the symbol etched into the stone, and Silas Hawthorne's cold, unyielding gaze as he spoke of power and destiny. His words lingered, echoing in the quiet corners of her mind. The Silent Ones are eternal. The Silent Ones. Reyes had uncovered enough to know that Hawthorne was telling the truth, at least partially. Taking him down was only the beginning. The network of people who had enabled him, supported him, and funded his operations was still out there. Their influence stretched far beyond the tunnels. They were in boardrooms, city council meetings, and maybe even in the precinct itself. The thought made her stomach churn. Ethan's recovery was slow but steady. He had been transferred to a safe location under the department's care, and his parents had been notified. Reyes had visited him once already, sitting by his bedside as he struggled to process everything he had been through. The boy was withdrawn, his eyes carrying the weight of secrets he hadn't yet shared. But Reyes didn't push him. He would talk when he was ready. For now, she had to focus on the case. The files she had recovered from the tunnels were a treasure trove of information, names, dates, locations, but they were also a labyrinth of coded messages and cryptic references. Reyes had enlisted Dana, the department's tech analyst, to help decode them. Dana had been working nonstop, her desk piled high with printouts and flashing monitors. "Detective," Dana called, snapping Reyes out of her thoughts. She hurried over to the tech station, where Dana gestured to her screen. "You're going to want to see this." The monitor displayed a series of emails pulled from Hawthorne's encrypted files. Most of them were mundane, discussions about construction permits and budget approvals, but one thread stood out. It was marked with a single, ominous word as its subject line: initiation. Reyes leaned in, her eyes scanning the emails. They were addressed to a group of individuals referred to only by their initials. The messages discussed upcoming ceremonies and new recruits, but the language was vague and deliberately cryptic. One line, however, sent a chill down Reyes' spine: "The artifact has been secured. The circle will be complete." "What circle?" Reyes muttered under her breath. Dana pointed to the last email in the thread. It contained an attachment, a map. "I haven't been able to decrypt the entire thing yet, but it looks like it's pointing to another location. Somewhere outside the city." Reyes studied the blurry map on the screen. If the Silent Ones had another base of operations, she needed to find it. And fast. "Can you clean this up?" she asked. Dana nodded. "Give me an hour." Reyes returned to her desk, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Hawthorne had been a leader, but he wasn't a leader. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone higher up the chain. The emails hinted at a hierarchy within the Silent Ones, but they gave no indication of who was at the top or how far their influence extended. An hour later, Dana handed Reyes a printed copy of the decrypted map. It showed a remote area just outside the city, near a stretch of dense forest. The location was marked with a symbol, a variation of the one Reyes had seen in the tunnels. Beneath it was a single word: sanctuary. "Sanctuary," Reyes whispered, her brow furrowing. "What the hell are they hiding out there?" She didn't wait to find out. Within the hour, she was on the road, the map spread out on the passenger seat of her car. The drive was long and uneventful, the city skyline fading into rolling hills and winding roads. As she approached the marked location, the forest grew denser, the trees closing in like sentinels guarding a secret. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Reyes parked her car at the edge of the woods, carefully concealing it behind a cluster of bushes. She stepped out, her hand instinctively resting on the grip of her holstered gun. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. She pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gathering darkness. The map led her to a clearing deep within the forest. At its center stood an old stone structure, partially hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It looked ancient, its weathered walls etched with more of the symbols she had come to associate with the Silent Ones. Reyes approached cautiously, her flashlight sweeping across the ground. She spotted footprints in the dirt, recent ones. The structure had a single entrance, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron. Reyes tested the handle and found it unlocked. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was damp and stale, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. The room was small and empty, save for a staircase spiraling downward. Another descent into darkness. Reyes took a deep breath, steeling herself, and began her descent. The steps were uneven and slippery, and the further she went, the colder the air became. Her flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the oppressive blackness. When she finally reached the bottom, she found herself in a cavern much like the one beneath the city. But this one was different. It was larger, more elaborate. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding a stone pedestal. On each pedestal sat an object: rings, daggers, small statues, all of them intricately carved and radiating an aura of menace. At the center of the cavern was a massive circular stone table, its surface engraved with the same spiral eye symbol Reyes had seen in Ethan's sketchbook. And standing at the table, his back to her, was a man. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark cloak pooling around his feet. Reyes raised her gun, her voice firm. Turn around. Slowly. The man obeyed, pivoting to face her. His face was obscured by a mask, a grotesque thing fashioned from bone and metal, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into her soul. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant. Detective Reyes. You've come a long way. Take off the mask, Reyes ordered, her finger tightening on the trigger. The man chuckled, the sound echoing in the cavern. You've already met my subordinate, Silas. But I am the true voice of the silent ones. Reyes' stomach tightened. You're the leader. I am merely a servant of the order, he said. And you, detective, have been chosen. Chosen for what? Reyes demanded, her voice rising. The man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. To join us. To bring balance to the chaos above. You've seen the corruption, the decay. You felt it in your own life, and the pain of your past. We can offer you purpose. Power. A chance to reshape the world. Reyes shook her head, her grip on the gun unwavering. I'm not interested in your cult. The man tilted his head, as if studying her. You say that now, but the darkness is already within you. You've carried it for years, haven't you? The loss, the anger, the guilt. It's what brought you here. Enough, Reyes snapped. Where's the rest of your group? Where are the silent ones? The man spread his arms, gesturing to the cavern. We are everywhere. And soon, you'll see that resistance is futile. Before Reyes could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating a dozen figures emerging from the shadows. They wore the same cloaks and masks, their presence suffocating in its silence. Reyes' heart pounded. She was surrounded. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Reyes' breathing steadied as her training kicked in. She backed toward the center of the cavern, her flashlight darting between the cloaked figures closing in. Each step she took was deliberate, her gun aimed steadily for the first sign of a threat. The masked leader remained still, his posture calm and unnerving, as if he had orchestrated this moment from the very beginning. Stay back. Reyes barked, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. I'm not here to join your twisted little club. I'm here to end it. The leader chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Detective, you misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. You arrived because you were meant to. This is your destiny. I make my own destiny, Reyes shot back, the edge in her voice sharper than ever. The masked figures moved closer, their footsteps eerily synchronized. Reyes counted at least a dozen of them, but the flickering light and the oppressive darkness made it hard to be sure. She scanned the room, her eyes darting toward potential exits, but the only way out seemed to be the way she came in. And that staircase was now blocked by two of the cloaked figures. Enough of this, Reyes growled, her patience wearing thin. She turned her gun back on the leader. Call them off or I drop you where you stand. The leader tilted his head, as if amused by her defiance. Violence will not save you here. You're standing in a place older than your city, older than your laws. You're standing in the heart of truth. Truth? Reyes scoffed. You mean the lies you've been feeding people to keep them scared? To keep them under your control? I've read enough about you and your so-called silent ones to know you're nothing but a bunch of power-hungry psychopaths. The leader's calm demeanor cracked just slightly, his voice hardening. Power is the only constant, detective. The only truth. And you, like so many before you, are afraid to embrace it. One of the cloaked figures lunged, and Reyes didn't hesitate. She fired a single shot, the crack of her gun reverberating like a thunderclap. The figure dropped to the ground, motionless. The others froze for a moment, as if stunned by the act. But then they advanced again, faster this time, their movements more aggressive. Reyes fired twice more, dropping another figure and forcing the rest to scatter. She moved quickly, putting the stone table between herself and the encroaching circle of attackers. Her flashlight swung wildly, the beam catching flashes of bone masks and glinting daggers in the hands of the cloaked figures. "Enough," the leader barked, his voice booming. The figures stopped in their tracks, their obedience instant and chilling. Reyes kept her gun trained on the nearest one, her finger twitching on the trigger. The leader stepped forward, his mask gleaming in the dim light. "Detective Reyes, you've proven your strength. But strength alone will not save you. You've stumbled into a world far greater than you can comprehend. And now, you'll face the consequences." Reyes's mind raced. She needed to turn the tables, to regain control of the situation. "You keep talking about power, about destiny. But all I see is a man hiding behind a mask, too scared to face the world above." The leader paused, his head tilting slightly. "You think I hide? Detective, I am the one who shapes the world above. Every decision, every law, every thread of your fragile society, we pull it from the shadows. We are not hiding. We are ruling." "Not anymore," Reyes said, her voice cold. "The artifact is gone. Hawthorne is gone. Your little empire is crumbling." The leader stiffened at the mention of the artifact. "You don't understand its significance. You've taken something you cannot possibly comprehend." "Try me," Reyes challenged, her grip on her gun unwavering. The leader let out a slow, measured breath. "The artifact is not merely a relic. It is a key, a conduit to the power that has sustained us for centuries. Without it, the Silent Ones cannot complete the circle." "But with it," he trailed off, his tone dripping with ominous intent. Reyes's stomach turned. She had suspected the artifact was important, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of urgency coursing through her. She needed to end this, now. "Well, too bad for you," she said, her voice sharp. "Because it's locked up tight, far away from your reach. Your little cult is finished." For the first time, the leader seemed genuinely angry. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You think locking it away will stop us? You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable." Before Reyes could respond, the cavern shook violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the stone walls groaned as if the earth itself was shifting. The masked figures exchanged uneasy glances, their composure faltering. Even the leader looked momentarily unsettled. "What the hell is that?" Reyes demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. The leader recovered quickly, his tone smug. "It seems you've awakened something, Detective. Perhaps you've underestimated the power of this place." Another tremor rocked the cavern, and Reyes struggled to keep her balance. She glanced around, her mind racing. The tremors weren't natural, something was causing them. She needed to get out, and fast. The masked figures began to retreat, their loyalty to the leader apparently not strong enough to keep them in the collapsing cavern. Reyes took advantage of the chaos, darting toward the staircase. But before she could reach it, the leader stepped into her path, his imposing frame blocking the way. "You can't run from this, Detective," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You've opened a door that cannot be closed." Reyes leveled her gun at his chest. "Move. Now." The leader hesitated, then slowly stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Run back to your world above. But know this, the Silent Ones are eternal. And we will rise again." Reyes didn't wait to hear more. She bolted up the stairs, her flashlight guiding her through the darkness. The tremors grew stronger with each passing second, the walls cracking and groaning as the cavern began to collapse. She reached the surface just as the ground gave a final, violent shudder. The entrance to the tunnels caved in behind her, sealing whatever secrets lay below. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, the cool night air biting at her skin. The forest was eerily quiet, as if the earth itself had exhaled in relief. But Reyes knew this wasn't over. The Silent Ones were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they regained what they had lost. As she made her way back to her car, one thought burned in her mind: she had to end this, once and for all. The Silent Ones might have been eternal, but so was her determination. This wasn't just about Ethan, or the artifact, or even the city. This was about justice. And Reyes wasn't going to stop until she brought the entire shadowy empire crashing down. Reyes drove back to the city, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The forest disappeared in her rearview mirror, but the weight of what had transpired refused to leave her. The Silent Ones had been operating in the shadows for far too long, and the deeper she dug, the more she realized just how far their influence extended. Silas Hawthorne was merely a cog in a much larger machine. The leader she had encountered, his commanding presence, his cryptic words, was something else entirely. The way he spoke about power, about shaping the world above, sent chills down her spine. He wasn't just delusional, he believed in something far more sinister, and worse, he had followers who believed it too. By the time she reached the precinct, the city lights were beginning to fade as dawn approached. Reyes parked her car and entered the building with a renewed sense of purpose. She needed answers. She needed to piece together everything she'd learned and figure out her next move. The Silent Ones might think they could intimidate her, but they were wrong. If they wanted a war, she'd bring it to them. Inside the precinct, the night shift was just wrapping up. Dana was still at her desk, her face illuminated by the glow of her multiple monitors. She looked up as Reyes approached, the dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. "Detective," Dana said, her tone a mix of relief and worry. "I've been trying to reach you. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Reyes said, though her voice lacked conviction. She dropped into a chair next to Dana's desk and gestured toward the screen. "Tell me you found something." Dana nodded, swiveling her chair to face the main monitor. "I've been digging through the files you recovered from the tunnels, and I think I finally cracked their code. It's a series of financial transactions, huge sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts. And get this, it's all tied to companies and organizations that, on the surface, look completely legitimate." Reyes leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of companies?" "Construction firms, logistics companies, even a few charitable foundations," Dana explained. "But when you dig deeper, you find connections to known criminal enterprises. It's like a web, and at the center of it all is the Silent Ones." Reyes let out a slow breath, her mind racing. "If we can follow the money, we might be able to identify more of their members. Maybe even their leader." Dana hesitated, her expression grim. "There's more. I found references to something called Project Ascension. It's mentioned in several of the emails, but there's no explanation of what it actually is. Just that it's critical to their plans." "Project Ascension," Reyes repeated, the words heavy on her tongue. "Whatever it is, it can't be good." Dana nodded. "I also found something else. A name." She pulled up a document on the screen and pointed to a highlighted section. "Alastair Kane." Reyes's brow furrowed. "Who's Alastair Kane?" "From what I can tell, he's a former high-ranking government official," Dana said. "He disappeared about 10 years ago, dropped off the map completely. No one knows where he is or what he's been doing, but he's mentioned multiple times in these files. The Silent Ones seem to revere him." Reyes's stomach tightened. "You think he's their leader?" "It's possible," Dana admitted. "But there's no solid proof yet. Just whispers and references." Reyes stood, her mind already formulating a plan. "Then we find him. If he's the one pulling the strings, we need to cut him off." Dana hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Detective, this is big. Bigger than anything we've dealt with before. If Kane is involved, he's not going to be easy to find. And if the Silent Ones know we're looking for him..." Reyes placed a hand on Dana's shoulder, her expression resolute. "I know the risks. But we don't have a choice. They've been operating in the shadows for too long, and it's time we bring them into the light." Dana nodded, her determination matching Reyes's. "I'll keep digging. If there's a trail, I'll find it." Reyes left Dana to her work and made her way to the evidence room. She needed to see the artifact again, to study it, to understand why it was so important to the Silent Ones. The room was cold and sterile, the rows of locked cabinets holding the remnants of countless cases. Reyes unlocked the cabinet containing the artifact and carefully removed it. The stone carving was smaller than she remembered, but its intricate design was just as mesmerizing. The spiral eye symbol was carved into its surface, surrounded by strange markings that looked like a forgotten language. Reyes turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the grooves. What was it about this object that made it so valuable? Why had Hawthorne and his followers been willing to kill for it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun, but it was only Lieutenant Parker, her superior. His graying hair and weary eyes gave him the look of a man who had seen too much in his years on the force. "Reyes," he said, his tone gruff but not unkind. "I heard you've been making waves." Reyes placed the artifact back in its box and locked the cabinet. "Just doing my job, sir." Parker crossed his arms, steadying her. "I read your report on the tunnels. The Silent Ones, the artifact, the missing kid, it's a hell of a mess you've uncovered." "It's more than a mess," Reyes said, her voice firm. "It's a conspiracy. And it goes deeper than anyone realizes." Parker nodded slowly. "I trust you, Reyes. You've got good instincts. But be careful. If these people are as dangerous as you say, they won't take kindly to you poking around." Reyes met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "I'm not backing down, Lieutenant. Not until I take them down." Parker sighed, a hint of pride in his expression. "Just watch your back." Reyes spent the rest of the day going over case files, connecting dots, and following leads. By the time night fell, she felt no closer to the truth, but she refused to give up. She knew the Silent Ones were out there, watching, waiting. But she also knew she had the advantage. For the first time, they had been exposed, and that made them vulnerable. As she sat at her desk, staring at the artifact's photo on her computer screen, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Dana. "Found something. Come to my office." Reyes grabbed her coat and headed to the tech station, her heart pounding. Whatever Dana had found, it could be the break they needed. And Reyes was ready. She wasn't just hunting the Silent Ones anymore. She was preparing for war. Reyes strode swiftly to Dana's office, her boots clicking against the tiled floor of the precinct. The urgency of Dana's text sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. She pushed open the door to find Dana hunched over her keyboard, the glow of her monitors reflecting in her tired but focused eyes. Without looking up, Dana gestured for Reyes to come closer. "I've got something big," Dana said, her voice tight with excitement and exhaustion. She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, pulling up a series of satellite images and documents on the main screen. "I traced the financial transactions from the Silent Ones files. A lot of the accounts were dead ends, offshore accounts, shell corporations, but one led me to a property registered under a pseudonym." Reyes leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she studied the screen. The image showed an aerial view of a sprawling estate surrounded by dense woods. The property was massive, with high walls, a mansion at its center, and a series of outbuildings scattered across the grounds. It was isolated, the nearest road a winding path several miles away. "Where is this?" Reyes asked, her voice low and steady. "About 50 miles outside the city," Dana replied. "It's listed as a private retreat owned by a non-existent company. But here's the kicker, there's a connection to Alastair Kane. The deed was signed by someone using his initials." Reyes's jaw tightened. "So, this could be where Kane's hiding." Dana nodded. "It's more than that. The property matches descriptions from some of the Silent Ones' encrypted files. They call it the Sanctuary. If they're still active, this is where they're operating from." Reyes straightened, her mind already formulating a plan. "Then we need to move. I'll take a team and hit the estate before they have a chance to relocate." Dana hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her desk. Reyes, this isn't just some abandoned warehouse. This place is a fortress. If Kane is there, he's going to have security, probably armed. You'll be walking into a hornet's nest. Reyes's eyes hardened. I've walked into worse. If we wait, we might lose our chance to catch him. Dana sighed but nodded. Then I'll keep digging. I'll feed you as much intel as I can before you go in. Reyes placed a hand on Dana's shoulder, a rare gesture of gratitude. You've done good work, Dana. Now it's time to finish this. Reyes didn't waste any time. She briefed her team, 6 of the precinct's best officers, including 2 from SWAT, and secured a warrant to raid the estate. The team geared up in silence, the tension palpable. Reyes could feel the weight of their anticipation, their unspoken questions about what they were walking into. But she knew better than to let doubt creep in. These people trusted her, and she wouldn't let them down. As the convoy of black SUVs sped toward the estate under the cover of darkness, Reyes reviewed the satellite images one last time. The property's layout was intricate, with multiple entry points but also numerous blind spots. The main house seemed to be the focal point, but Reyes suspected the outbuildings could hold secrets of their own. This is a standard breach and clear, she said into her comms, her voice firm and commanding. We move in fast and secure the property. Priority is locating Alistair Kane and any members of the Silent Ones. Watch each other's backs, and don't underestimate them. These people are dangerous. The team responded with a chorus of affirmatives. Reyes clenched her jaw, her hand tightening around the grip of her weapon. She hated the moments before action, the waiting, the anticipation. But once the operation began, she knew the adrenaline would take over. The SUVs came to a stop half a mile from the estate. The team disembarked silently, moving through the woods with practiced precision. Reyes led the way, her flashlight off, her senses heightened. The night was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. When they reached the edge of the property, Reyes signaled for the team to spread out. 2 officers moved toward the east side of the estate, while another pair circled to the west. Reyes and the remaining officers approached the front gate, their weapons at the ready. The gate was locked, but one of the officers quickly cut through the chain with bolt cutters. The team moved in, their footsteps muffled against the gravel path. Reyes's heart pounded as they approached the main house. The mansion loomed before them, its windows dark, its towering facade both imposing and silent. Reyes signaled for the team to stack up at the front door. One of the SWAT officers placed a breaching charge, and with a muffled explosion, the door was blown open. The team surged inside, their movements swift and coordinated. Reyes swept her flashlight across the grand foyer, the beam illuminating ornate furniture, a massive chandelier, and a long staircase leading to the upper floors. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something metallic, blood, maybe, though Reyes couldn't be sure. Clear the ground floor, she ordered, her voice low but firm. Watch for traps. The team fanned out, checking each room methodically. Reyes moved toward a doorway on the left, her gun raised. She entered what appeared to be a study, the walls lined with bookshelves and a large desk dominating the center of the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a map was pinned to the wall. Reyes stepped closer, her flashlight revealing markings on the map, circles, lines, and symbols that mirrored those she had seen in the tunnels. Reyes, you need to see this, one of the officers called from the hallway. She turned and joined the officer in what appeared to be a dining room. The long table was set, but the plates were empty, and the room had an air of abandonment. What caught Reyes's attention, however, was the large painting that dominated one wall. It depicted a spiral eye symbol, similar to the one she had found on the artifact, but more elaborate. Around it were figures in cloaks, their hands raised as if in worship. It's them, Reyes said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Silent Ones. Before she could say more, a sharp crack echoed through the house, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Reyes's comms crackled to life. East team under fire. Multiple hostiles, request backup. Reyes turned to her team, her heart racing. Move! Now! The team sprinted toward the east wing, their boots pounding against the hardwood floors. The sound of gunfire grew louder, interspersed with shouts and the crash of furniture. Reyes rounded a corner and nearly collided with one of the East team officers, his face pale and streaked with blood. "They're everywhere," he gasped. "It's a damn ambush." Reyes pushed past him, her gun raised. The East Wing was chaos. Masked figures darted through the shadows, firing at the officers. Reyes took cover behind an overturned table, returning fire. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. How had the Silent Ones known they were coming? As she reloaded, Reyes caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A cloaked figure sprinted down a hallway, something glinting in his hand. Reyes didn't hesitate. She broke cover and gave chase, her boots pounding against the floor as she pursued him. The figure darted through a doorway and down a flight of stairs, disappearing into the darkness below. Reyes followed, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder as she descended, the walls narrowing around her. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a stone corridor, its walls damp and lined with torches. The corridor stretched ahead, leading deeper into the estate's underground. Her comm crackled. "Reyes, what's your status?" "We're pinned down up here." "I'm in pursuit," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold your position. I'll handle this." She moved forward cautiously, her gun raised. The corridor twisted and turned, the flickering torchlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Reyes's pulse quickened as she realized where she was. This wasn't just a basement or a cellar. It was a tunnel, one that felt all too familiar. The Silent Ones had built their sanctuary on top of another secret. And Reyes was about to find out what it was. Reyes pressed forward, her flashlight barely penetrating the oppressive darkness of the tunnel. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her skin crawl. The walls were carved stone, ancient and uneven, with strange etchings that pulsed in the torchlight. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was descending into something far older and far more dangerous than the Silent Ones themselves. Her boots echoed faintly with each step, the sound swallowed by the tunnel's eerie silence. She moved cautiously, every sense on high alert. The figure she had been chasing had disappeared into the shadows, but Reyes knew he was close. The tunnel twisted sharply ahead, and she slowed, her gun raised, her breath steady. As she rounded the corner, her flashlight caught a flicker of movement. The cloaked figure stood at the end of the hall, his back to her. He was hunched slightly, as if he were examining something on the wall. Reyes trained her weapon on him, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Freeze! Hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough for Reyes to catch a glimpse of the bone mask he wore. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Slowly, he raised one arm and placed his hand against the wall. The carvings around his fingers seemed to shimmer and shift, as if they were alive. "Don't move!" Reyes barked, stepping closer. "Take your hand off the wall, now!" The figure ignored her. Instead, he pressed harder, and a low rumble began to vibrate through the tunnel. Reyes's heart skipped a beat as the floor beneath her feet trembled. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their patterns coalescing into the spiral eye symbol she had come to dread. "What the hell are you doing?" Reyes demanded, her voice edged with panic. The figure finally turned to face her, his masked visage obscured by the flickering light. When he spoke, his voice was low and distorted, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. "You're too late, Detective. The circle is nearly complete." Reyes didn't wait for him to finish. She pulled the trigger, the sharp crack of her gun echoing through the tunnel. The figure jerked backward and crumpled to the ground, the mask slipping from his face to reveal a middle-aged man with hollow eyes and pale skin. But Reyes had no time to process what she had done. The rumbling continued, growing louder, and the glow of the carvings intensified. She stepped over the body, her flashlight sweeping the walls. The tunnel seemed to be alive, the symbols writhing and shifting in ways that defied logic. Ahead, the corridor widened into a massive chamber, its ceiling arching high above. Reyes's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. The chamber was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls were covered in the spiral eye symbol, each one glowing with a pulsating light that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface engraved with intricate patterns. Surrounding the altar were more cloaked figures, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in silent prayer. And at the far end of the chamber, seated on a raised throne carved from the same ancient stone, was Alastair Kane. Reyes froze, her gun trained on the man who had eluded justice for over a decade. Kane was older than she had expected, his face gaunt and lined with deep creases. But his eyes were sharp, piercing, and filled with a power that made her skin crawl. He wore no mask, and his presence was commanding, almost otherworldly. "Detective Reyes," Kane said, his voice smooth and resonant. "I've been expecting you." Reyes stepped forward, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Alastair Kane. You're under arrest." Kane chuckled, the sound echoing through the chamber like a sinister melody. "Arrest? Is that what you think this is about? You've stumbled into something far greater than your laws, your police force, your fragile understanding of the world." "Spare me the monologue," Reyes snapped. "Stand up and put your hands behind your head. Now." Kane remained seated, his expression calm. "You don't understand, detective. You've been chosen. All your life, you've been drawn to the shadows, to the darkness. It's no coincidence that you found us. You were meant to be here." Reyes's jaw tightened. "I'm here because I'm going to stop you. Whatever you're planning, this Project Ascension, it ends here." Kane leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "Stop me? You're standing in a place older than time itself. This chamber, this altar, they are conduits of power, connecting us to something far greater than you can imagine. And you are the final piece of the puzzle." Reyes's blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The artifact," Kane said, his voice reverent. "It was merely a key. But you, detective, you are the lock. Your presence here completes the circle. And now, the Silent Ones will ascend." Reyes's mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. The glowing symbols, the altar, the artifact, it all pointed to something beyond her comprehension. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. The cloaked figures surrounding the altar began to move, their chanting rising in a haunting crescendo. "Stop!" Reyes shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. "Don't take another step." But the figures ignored her, their chant growing louder, more insistent. The glow of the symbols intensified, filling the chamber with an otherworldly light. Reyes's hands trembled as she aimed her gun at Kane. "I'll shoot." "Don't think I won't." Kane smiled, his expression serene. "You can't stop what has already begun." Before Reyes could react, the ground beneath her feet trembled violently. The light from the symbols coalesced into a beam that shot upward, piercing the ceiling and disappearing into the darkness above. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the chamber itself was alive and pulsing with energy. Reyes staggered back, her vision blurring as the light enveloped her. She could hear Kane's voice, faint and distant, as if he were speaking from another world. "Embrace it, detective. Embrace your destiny." And then, everything went black. When Reyes opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold stone floor of the chamber. The glow of the symbols had faded, and the room was eerily silent. She pushed herself to her feet, her head pounding. The cloaked figures were gone, and the altar was empty. But Kane was still there, standing at the far end of the chamber. He looked at her with a mixture of triumph and pity. "It's done," he said softly. "The circle is complete." Reyes raised her gun, her hands shaking. What did you do?" Kane smiled, but there was no malice in it. "You'll understand soon enough." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Reyes alone in the chamber, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a suffocating shroud. Reyes stood frozen, her gun still raised, though there was no one left to aim it at. Kane's words echoed in her mind, "You'll understand soon enough." The chamber was deathly quiet now, the oppressive energy that had filled it moments before dissipated into an eerie stillness. Her flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the now empty altar and the strange carvings that seemed to stare back at her with silent intent. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to chase after Kane, but her legs felt like lead. She forced herself to take a step forward, her boots scraping against the cold stone floor. She scanned the walls for any sign of a hidden passage or exit where Kane might have gone, but the chamber seemed sealed. The only way out was the way she'd come in. Reyes pressed her earpiece, her voice steady despite the chaos still swirling in her mind. "Team, report. What's your status?" Static buzzed in her ear, then a faint voice broke through. "Reyes, we're regrouping, East Wing, heavy resistance." The signal was weak, but it was enough to tell her team was still alive and fighting. "Hold your position," she ordered. "I'm coming back." As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on the altar. Something about it drew her in, its worn surface, the intricate carvings that seemed to pulse faintly even in the absence of glowing light. She hesitated, then stepped closer, trailing her flashlight over its surface. A small depression in the center caught her attention. It was circular, about the size of the artifact that was now locked away at the precinct. Her stomach churned. The artifact wasn't just a key, it was meant to fit here. Whatever ritual Kane had initiated, it wasn't complete, or, at least, Reyes hoped it wasn't. She had stopped him from getting his hands on the artifact, but the fact that she had ended up here, in the very place it was meant to be used, couldn't be a coincidence. She shook the thought from her mind and focused on the mission. Kane had escaped, but the Silent One's network wasn't invincible. If she could get her team out alive, if they could gather enough evidence from the estate, they could dismantle this organization piece by piece. For now, she had to get back to her people. Reyes retraced her steps through the tunnel, her flashlight flickering as if even the batteries were uneasy in this place. The damp air grew colder the closer she got to the surface, and the faint sounds of distant gunfire reached her ears. She picked up her pace, her weapon drawn, her senses sharp. As she emerged from the tunnel into the east wing of the estate, the scene was chaos. Furniture lay overturned, bullet holes riddled the walls, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Her team had taken cover behind an overturned dining table, exchanging fire with several masked figures who had barricaded themselves at the far end of the hallway. "Detective," one of the officers shouted as she slid into cover beside them. "We thought we'd lost you." "I'm not that easy to get rid of," Reyes said, her tone sharp but reassuring. "What's the situation?" "We've got at least 4 hostiles pinned down in that hallway," the officer replied. "They're dug in, but we've taken out most of the others." Reyes nodded, quickly assessing the situation. The Silent Ones weren't just cultists, they were organized and well-armed. Whoever was backing them had resources, and that made them even more dangerous. "We need to push forward and secure the area." Kane slipped away, but we're not leaving without answers. She signaled to the SWAT officers, who prepared to lay down suppressing fire. On her mark, they opened up, the rapid staccato of gunfire echoing through the hall. Reyes and 2 other officers flanked the enemy, moving swiftly and staying low. One by one, the masked figures fell, their resistance crumbling under the assault. When the gunfire ceased, Reyes motioned for her team to sweep the area. She stepped into the now silent hallway, her eyes scanning for any clues. One of the figures lay sprawled near a door, a trail of blood leading from his chest to the floor. Reyes crouched beside him, pulling off his mask. The man's face was pale, his lips moving faintly as he struggled to speak. Reyes leaned in close. "Where's Kane?" she demanded. The man's eyes flickered open, his gaze unfocused. "You don't understand," he rasped. "It's already begun." "What's begun?" Reyes pressed, her voice sharp. What did Kane do? The man coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. The ascension, the artifact, it's only the first step. His head lolled to the side, his breathing slowing until it stopped entirely. Reyes cursed under her breath, standing and wiping her hands on her pants as if trying to rid herself of the weight of his words. Only the first step. Detective, one of the SWAT officers called from a room further down the hall. You need to see this. Reyes joined him, stepping into what appeared to be a study. The room was lined with bookshelves, but it wasn't the books that caught her attention, it was the map spread out across the desk. It was massive, covering the entire surface, with markings scattered across it. Cities, towns, and even remote locations were circled in red, connected by a web of lines. At the center of the map was a symbol Reyes now hated more than anything else, the spiral eye. What is this? She muttered, leaning over the desk. It looks like targets, the officer said hesitantly. Or maybe locations they're operating in. Reyes' stomach sank. The silent ones weren't just a local threat. This map suggested their influence stretched far beyond the city, maybe even beyond the country. Get photos of everything, she ordered. I want every detail documented. As the officers worked to secure the room and gather evidence, Reyes felt a knot of dread forming in her chest. The deeper she dug, the larger this conspiracy grew. Kane's escape wasn't just a setback, it was a warning. The silent ones weren't done, and whatever they were planning next would be even worse. By the time the estate was secured and the remaining hostiles detained, the sun was beginning to rise. Reyes stood outside, her arms crossed as she watched the SWAT team load the prisoners into armored vehicles. The estate was now swarming with law enforcement, but Reyes couldn't shake the feeling that they were still playing catch-up. Dana's voice crackled over her earpiece. Reyes, I've been monitoring chatter on some encrypted channels. There's talk of movement, silent ones regrouping in other areas. Whatever Kane's planning, it's not over. Reyes clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the horizon. Then we don't stop. We follow every lead, shut down every operation, and find Kane before he can pull this off. There was a pause before Dana replied, her voice heavy. You know this is bigger than just him, right? Kane might be the leader, but the silent ones, they're a machine. Taking him out won't stop everything. I know, Reyes said quietly. But it's a start. As the vehicles pulled away and the estate fell silent, Reyes allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had survived the night, but the battle was far from over. The silent ones were still out there, their plans moving forward like clockwork. And Reyes knew one thing for certain, she wouldn't stop until every piece of their twisted empire was reduced to rubble. Reyes leaned against the side of the last remaining SWAT vehicle, her arms crossed and her mind racing. The estate was no longer a battlefield, but the weight of what she had uncovered felt heavier than any firefight. The silent ones weren't just a cult of zealots, they were an intricate, deeply entrenched network, and she was only beginning to grasp the scale of their operations. The map in the study was proof of that. Detective, one of the SWAT officers said as he approached, his face still streaked with sweat and dirt. We've done a full sweep of the estate. No sign of Kane. The tunnel entrance in the east wing collapsed before we could send anyone in. Looks like he had an escape route planned. Reyes nodded grimly. Of course he did. He's always one step ahead. She ran a hand through her hair, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. What about the prisoners? Any of them talking? The officer shook his head. Not yet. They're loyal, or scared, maybe both. But we'll keep trying. Reyes sighed. She had expected as much. The silent ones had built their empire on secrecy and fear. Breaking through that wall would take more than a few hours in an interrogation room. Get them back to the precinct and start the process. I want to know everything they know, every name, every location, every contact. Yes, ma'am, the officer said, turning to oversee the transport of the detainees. Reyes pulled out her phone and dialed Dana's number. It rang twice before the analyst picked up, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Reyes, tell me you've got something. I've got a dozen prisoners who won't talk, a collapsed tunnel, and a map full of red circles that might as well be bullseyes, Reyes replied, her tone sharper than she intended. She softened it slightly. But we did find evidence. Enough to connect the Silent Ones to operations well beyond the city. I'm sending you photos of the map we recovered. I need you to cross-reference the locations, see if there's any pattern, anything that ties them together. On it, Dana said immediately. What about Kane? Gone, Reyes said flatly. But he won't stay in the shadows for long. He's too arrogant for that. Whatever he's planning, this ascension, he'll make his move soon. We just need to figure out where and when. Dana hesitated before responding. Reyes, you've been going nonstop since this whole case started. You need to rest. Let me and the team work on this for a few hours. We'll. I don't have time to rest, Reyes interrupted, her voice firm. Kane is out there, and we're running out of time. Dana didn't argue, though her silence spoke volumes. I'll let you know as soon as I find something, she said finally. Thanks, Dana, Reyes replied, ending the call. She pocketed her phone and glanced back at the estate. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of luxury and power, now looked like a hollow shell, emptied of its secrets, yet still holding the echoes of what had transpired within its walls. Reyes knew she couldn't leave the scene just yet. There was always something overlooked, some clue hiding in plain sight. As the officers finished their work, Reyes walked the perimeter of the estate, her eyes scanning every detail. The grounds were eerily still, the trees swaying gently in the early morning breeze. She stopped near the edge of the forest, where the collapsed tunnel entrance was marked off with caution tape. The ground was uneven, the dirt freshly disturbed. Reyes crouched down, running her fingers over a jagged piece of stone that had been dislodged in the collapse. It was carved with part of the spiral eye symbol, its edges sharp and precise. She pocketed it, her instincts telling her it might be important, even if she didn't yet understand why. Detective, a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Lieutenant Parker walking toward her, his expression as grim as ever. I just got the preliminary report. Looks like you uncovered a hell of a mess here. Mess doesn't even begin to cover it, Reyes muttered, standing and dusting off her hands. Kane got away, but we've got evidence. Enough to prove the Silent Ones are operating on a massive scale. This isn't just a local problem, Parker. They're everywhere. Parker frowned, his brow furrowing. And you think this ascension is their next move? Reyes nodded. Kane said it himself. Whatever they're planning, they think it's inevitable. That map we found, it's not just a list of locations. It's a blueprint. We need to figure out what they're targeting and why. Parker rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes scanning the estate. You're playing a dangerous game, Reyes. These people aren't just criminals, they're fanatics. And if they've got the kind of resources you're talking about, they won't hesitate to take you out. I know the risks, Reyes said evenly. But I'm not stopping. Not until I bring them down. Parker studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. I'll make sure the department gives you everything you need. But be careful. We can't afford to lose you. Reyes didn't respond. She turned back toward the estate, her mind already racing with possibilities. The Silent Ones were on the move, and she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Back at the precinct, Reyes sat in the dimly lit conference room, the map from the estate spread out before her. Dana had joined her, along with a handful of other detectives and analysts. The room buzzed with quiet activity as they worked to piece together the puzzle. I've cross-referenced the locations on the map, Dana said, pointing to a series of circles marked in red. Most of them are in remote areas, old warehouses, abandoned churches, places that wouldn't draw attention. But a few are in major cities. And this one, she tapped a circle near the center of the map. It's here. In our city. Reyes's eyes narrowed. What's at that location? Dana pulled up a file on her tablet. It's an old industrial site on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for years, but the property was recently purchased by one of the Silent One's shell companies. Reyes leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If they're operating this close to home, it's not just a coincidence. They're planning something big. Dana hesitated. There's something else. I found a reference to the site in one of the encrypted emails. They called it the convergence point. I don't know what it means, but it sounds significant. Reyes stared at the map, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Then that's where we go next. If this is their convergence point, we can't wait for them to make the first move. Dana nodded, but her expression was one of concern. Reyes, this could be a trap. They know we're onto them. Maybe, Reyes said, her voice firm. But it's a risk we have to take. If we wait, we lose the advantage. She stood, her resolve hardening. We hit the site tonight. Quiet and fast. If Kane's there, we take him. And if not, she glanced at the map, her jaw tightening. We make sure whatever they're planning never sees the light of day. The room fell silent as the team absorbed her words. They all knew the stakes and the danger. But Reyes saw no hesitation in their faces, only determination. The Silent Ones thought they were untouchable. They thought their secrets would protect them. But Reyes was about to prove them wrong. The conference room buzzed with a tense energy as Reyes and her team finalized their plan. A whiteboard at the front of the room was covered with hastily scrawled notes, maps, and photographs of the industrial site Dana had identified. The words convergence point were circled in red, a stark reminder of the stakes. Reyes stood at the center of it all, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp as she addressed the group. This isn't just another raid, she said, her voice steady but commanding. We're walking into what could be the Silent One's most critical operation. If this site really is their convergence point, then it's ground zero for whatever they've been planning. We can't afford to screw this up. The team nodded, their faces grim but resolute. Dana stood near the projector, flipping through slides of the site's blueprints. The industrial complex is massive, she explained. Multiple buildings, several of them connected by underground tunnels. We're looking at a lot of ground to cover. Do we have a layout of those tunnels? One of the SWAT officers asked. Dana shook her head. Not exactly. The original blueprints were destroyed years ago, and whatever the Silent Ones have done to the site since then hasn't been documented. But based on satellite images and thermal scans, I've identified at least 3 potential entry points to the underground network. Reyes stepped forward, tapping the map on the screen. We'll split into 3 teams. Team Alpha will secure the main building. If Kane's there, that's where he'll be. Team Bravo will take the secondary structure and cut off any potential escape routes. Team Charlie will focus on the tunnels. If they're hiding anything down there, I want it found. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Reyes continued, her tone firm. This is a high-risk operation. The Silent Ones are armed, organized, and fanatical. They won't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. Watch each other's backs, and don't take unnecessary risks. Our goal is to shut this operation down and bring Kane in alive, if possible. Understood? Yes, ma'am, the team responded in unison. Reyes nodded, her expression softening slightly. Good. Gear up. We move in 1 hour. The convoy of black SUVs rolled through the desolate streets on the outskirts of the city, their headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. Reyes sat in the lead vehicle, her hands resting on her lap as she stared out the window. The industrial site loomed in the distance, its rusted structures silhouetted against the faint glow of the city skyline. Detective, Dana's voice crackled through her earpiece. She was monitoring the operation remotely from the precinct. I'm picking up some unusual activity at the site. Heat signatures, more than we expected. They're concentrated in the main building and the tunnels. Reyes' stomach tightened. How many? At least 20, maybe more, Dana replied. It's hard to get an exact count. But they're moving fast. It's almost like they're preparing for something. Reyes glanced at the SWAT officer driving the SUV. Pick up the pace. We're running out of time. The vehicles pulled to a stop about half a mile from the site. The team disembarked quickly, each member checking their weapons and gear one last time. Reyes adjusted her tactical vest, the weight of her sidearm and comm equipment a familiar comfort. All teams, check in, she said into her comms. Team Alpha, ready, came the reply. Team Bravo, ready. Team Charlie, in position. Reyes took a deep breath. All right. Move in. Stay sharp. The teams advanced quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath them. The industrial site was eerily silent, the only sounds the faint creak of rusted metal and the distant hum of machinery. Reyes led Team Alpha toward the main building, her flashlight off, her senses on high alert. The entrance to the building was a massive steel door, its surface corroded with age. Reyes signaled to one of the SWAT officers, who placed a breaching charge on the door. The explosion was muffled but effective, the door swinging open with a loud groan. The team moved in swiftly, their weapons raised. The interior was a maze of rusted catwalks, broken machinery, and shadows that seemed to shift and twist in the dim light. Reyes's flashlight swept across the room, revealing symbols painted on the walls in dark, jagged strokes. The spiral eye was everywhere, its presence suffocating. Clear the ground floor, Reyes ordered, her voice low. Watch for movement. The team spread out, their boots echoing faintly against the concrete floor. Reyes moved toward the center of the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of Cain. The air was thick with the smell of oil and decay, and the faint sound of chanting reached her ears, sending a chill down her spine. Detective, one of the officers called. We've got something. Reyes joined him near the far wall, where a massive tarp covered what appeared to be a large object. The officer pulled the tarp back, revealing a strange metallic structure beneath. It was circular, with intricate carvings that mirrored the patterns on the artifact and the altar at the estate. What the hell is this? The officer muttered. Reyes's breath caught as she studied the structure. It was a machine, or part of one, and its design was like nothing she had ever seen. Dana, she said into her comms. Are you seeing this? Yeah, Dana replied, her voice tinged with awe and confusion. It looks ancient, but modern at the same time. Like someone rebuilt it using old designs. Reyes's stomach churned. Can you figure out what it does? Not without more data, Dana admitted. But if I had to guess, it's a power source. Or a conduit of some kind. Reyes turned to the officer. Secure the area. No one touches this thing until we know what we're dealing with. Before she could say more, her comm crackled with static, followed by a panicked voice. Team Charlie. We've got hostiles in the tunnels, repeat, heavy resistance. There. The transmission cut off abruptly. Charlie, come in. Reyes barked. Report. Silence. Reyes's jaw tightened. Alpha team, with me. We're heading to the tunnels. Bravo, hold your position and secure the secondary structure. The team regrouped quickly, exiting the main building and making their way to the tunnel entrance Dana had identified. The sound of gunfire echoed faintly from below, growing louder as they descended into the darkness. The tunnels were narrow and suffocating, the walls lined with the same glowing carvings Reyes had seen at the estate. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. As they moved deeper, the gunfire grew louder, interspersed with shouts and the sickening sound of close combat. Contact, one of the officers shouted as a masked figure emerged from the shadows, wielding a knife. Reyes fired instinctively, the figure collapsing to the ground. More emerged from the darkness, their movements frantic but coordinated. The tunnel erupted into chaos as the two sides clashed, the confined space amplifying every sound. Reyes fought with a precision born of years of training, her mind focused despite the chaos around her. But even as they pushed forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, driven deeper into the network of tunnels, towards something they weren't prepared to face. And then she saw it. The tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber, its walls covered in the spiral eye symbol. At the center of the room stood Alistair Kane, his arms raised, his voice echoing in a language Reyes couldn't understand. Around him, a dozen cloaked figures knelt in reverence, their faces obscured by masks. And behind him, suspended in midair by beams of light, was the artifact. It pulsed with a dark, otherworldly energy, its glow illuminating the room in flashes of red and black. Reyes raised her weapon, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. Kane. Step away from the artifact, now. Kane turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face. Ah, detective. Right on time. Reyes's fingers tightened on the trigger. This ends here. Kane's smile widened. Oh, detective, it's only just beginning. The chamber seemed to thrum with a life of its own as Kane's voice echoed through the vast space, carrying an unnatural resonance. The artifact behind him pulsed steadily, its crimson and black light casting eerie shadows across the cavern walls. The kneeling figures surrounding him did not flinch, their heads bowed as if in silent worship, their presence amplifying the oppressive atmosphere. Reyes tightened her grip on her firearm, her gaze locked on Kane. I said step away, she barked, her voice cutting through the strange energy that seemed to hang thick in the air. This is over, Kane. Surrender now, or I'll end it myself. Kane tilted his head, his expression calm, almost amused. Detective Reyes, he said with a slow, deliberate cadence, you've traveled so far, risked so much, and yet you still don't see. You think this is a battle you can win? You've already lost. Reyes took a step forward, her weapon still trained on him. Around her, her team moved cautiously into the chamber, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning for threats. The only thing I see is a madman hiding behind his delusions, she spat. You think this artifact makes you untouchable? You're wrong. Kane let out a low chuckle, his hands lowering slightly as he stepped away from the artifact. Madness, he said, his tone almost wistful, is the word we use for truths too vast and terrifying to comprehend. But soon, detective, you'll understand. You'll see what lies beyond the veil. Enough. Reyes snapped, her voice sharp. Get on your knees, now. Before Kane could respond, one of the kneeling figures suddenly stood, raising a weapon hidden beneath their cloak. The shot rang out before Reyes could react, the bullet ricocheting off the cavern wall near her head. Contact, one of the officers shouted, and chaos erupted. The cloaked figures sprang to life, abandoning their kneeling positions and drawing weapons or lunging at the officers with knives. Reyes delved behind a stone pillar for cover as the chamber filled with gunfire, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. She fired at one of the attackers, hitting them squarely in the chest, then turned her attention back to Kane. But he was moving. Kane backed toward the artifact, his hands raised as if in supplication. The light surrounding it grew brighter, its pulsing rhythm quickening. Reyes could feel the energy emanating from it, a deep, primal force that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Kane, she shouted, breaking cover and advancing toward him. Don't do this. He turned to face her, his expression serene. You can't stop it, detective. The ascension is inevitable. The silent ones will rise, and through them, the world will be reborn. Reyes fired, the shot aimed for his leg, but the energy surrounding the artifact seemed to distort the air, and the bullet veered off course, striking the ground near his feet. Kane didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer to the artifact, his hands reaching toward it. The room seemed to shudder as his fingers touched its surface. A wave of energy exploded outward, throwing Reyes and her team to the ground. Her vision blurred as the force hit her, a high-pitched ringing filling her ears. When she struggled to her feet, the sight before her made her freeze. The artifact was no longer just an object. It was alive, its surface shifting and writhing as if it were made of liquid fire. The spiral eye symbol at its center expanded and contracted like a beating heart, and from its core, a beam of light shot upward, piercing the ceiling of the cavern and disappearing into the darkness above. Kane stood at the center of it all, his body illuminated by the artifact's glow. His arms were outstretched, his head tilted back, his mouth moving as he chanted in that strange, guttural language Reyes had heard before. The cloaked figures around him had fallen silent, their attention fixed solely on him. Reyes. Dana's voice crackled through her earpiece, barely audible over the chaos. What's happening? I'm picking up massive energy readings from your location, like nothing I've ever seen. Reyes pressed a hand to her ear, her voice strained. Kane's activated the artifact. It's doing something. I don't know what, but we need to shut it down, now. There's no shutting it down, Kane said suddenly, his voice booming as if amplified by the artifact itself. He turned to face Reyes, his eyes glowing with the same unnatural light. The wheels are already in motion. The Silent Ones have waited centuries for this moment, and you will bear witness to their return. Reyes's heart pounded as she glanced at her team, who were still recovering from the blast. She had no idea what the artifact was capable of, but she knew one thing: if Kane succeeded, the consequences would be catastrophic. Take him out, she shouted to her team. Focus your fire on Kane. The officers opened fire, their bullets tearing through the air toward him. But as the shots drew near, the energy surrounding the artifact seemed to ripple, deflecting them like leaves caught in a gale. Kane stood untouched, his expression one of triumph. Reyes gritted her teeth, her mind racing. The artifact was protecting him, but there had to be a way to break through. Dana, she said into her comms, tell me you've got something. How do I stop this thing? Dana's voice was frantic. I don't know. The energy readings are off the charts, I've never seen anything like it. But if the artifact is acting as a power source, maybe disrupting its connection to Kane could shut it down. You need to sever whatever link he's established. How? Reyes demanded, her frustration boiling over. Destroy it, Dana said, her voice heavy with resignation. The artifact, the machine, whatever's amplifying its power. It's risky, but it's the only shot we've got. Reyes stared at the artifact, its light pulsating faster and faster. Destroying it wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. She had no idea what kind of energy it was emitting, or what would happen if it were destabilized. But she also knew she didn't have a choice. Cover me, she shouted to her team, breaking into a sprint toward the artifact. The room erupted into chaos once more as her officers laid down suppressing fire, keeping the remaining cloaked figures at bay. Reyes dodged a series of wild swings from one of the attackers, her focus locked on the artifact. As she neared it, the energy grew almost unbearable, the air around her crackling like a live wire. Kane saw her coming and extended a hand, his voice rising in a commanding tone. The energy around the artifact surged, and Reyes felt herself being pushed back, as if an invisible force were trying to repel her. She dug her heels into the ground, forcing herself forward inch by inch. You can't stop this, Detective, Kane said, his voice filled with both anger and pity. You're fighting against forces far beyond your understanding. Maybe, Reyes snarled, gritting her teeth as she fought against the energy. But I'll die trying. With one final push, she reached the artifact. She raised her weapon, aiming for its center, the heart of the spiral eye, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck true, and for a split second, the artifact seemed to shudder. And then the world exploded. The explosion was not fire and debris, it was light and sound, an eruption of energy so intense that Reyes felt as if every atom in her body was being torn apart and reassembled at the same time. She was thrown backward, slamming into the cold, stone floor of the chamber. Her vision blurred, her ears rang, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was still alive. The air around her shimmered, heavy with static that made her skin tingle. She struggled to her hands and knees, coughing as she tried to catch her breath. The artifact, or what was left of it, hovered in the air, fractured and pulsating erratically. Cracks spread across its surface like veins, leaking tendrils of dark, smoky energy that twisted and writhed before dissipating into nothingness. Kane's voice cut through the chaos, rising above the ringing in her ears. "You fool," he shouted, his calm facade finally shattered. His glowing eyes were wild, his face contorted with fury. "You've disrupted the ritual. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Reyes staggered to her feet, her weapon trembling in her hands. "Yeah," she rasped, her voice hoarse but defiant. "I stopped you." Kane laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that sent a chill down her spine. "No, detective. You've only accelerated the inevitable. The ascension cannot be stopped, it can only be delayed. And now, you've unleashed forces you cannot control." The ground beneath them began to quake, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each passing second. The chamber walls groaned as cracks spread through the stone, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Reyes glanced around, her heart pounding. The room was collapsing, and they were running out of time. "Team, report," she shouted into her comms, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "We're still here," one of the officers responded, his voice strained. "But the whole place is coming down. What's the plan?" Reyes's mind raced. They needed to get out of the tunnels before they were buried alive, but she couldn't let Kane escape, not again. She turned back to him, her weapon raised. "It's over, Kane. You're coming with me, or you're not coming out of here at all." Kane's eyes narrowed, his expression cold. "You still don't understand, do you? This is bigger than you, bigger than me. What's coming cannot be stopped. Not by you, not by anyone." Before Reyes could respond, Kane raised his arms, the fractured artifact behind him pulsating violently. The remaining cloaked figures, those who had not been gunned down by her team, began to chant again, their voices rising in unison. The energy in the room surged, the air growing thick with a palpable, almost suffocating pressure. "Reyes, we have to go," one of her officers shouted, grabbing her arm. "This place is coming down." But Reyes didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on Kane, on the desperate determination in his glowing gaze. He wasn't just trying to escape, he was still trying to complete the ritual, to use the artifact's remaining power to achieve whatever twisted goal he had in mind. "Not this time," Reyes muttered under her breath. She twisted free of the officer's grip and sprinted toward Kane, her boots pounding against the trembling ground. He saw her coming and raised one hand, a wave of force slamming into her like a battering ram. Reyes stumbled but didn't stop, her focus unrelenting. She reached him just as the artifact let out a deafening crack, its surface splitting wide open. Time seemed to slow as she raised her weapon, aiming directly at Kane. His eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, she saw something that almost looked like fear. But before she could pull the trigger, the artifact exploded in a final, blinding burst of light. When Reyes opened her eyes, she was lying on her back, staring up at a sky she didn't recognize. The cavern ceiling was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of dark clouds and crimson light. The air was cold and oppressive, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. She pushed herself up, her body aching, and looked around. The chamber was unrecognizable. The walls had crumbled, the floor fractured and uneven. The artifact was gone, completely obliterated, but its presence lingered in the form of a massive, glowing fissure in the center of the room. The spiral eye symbol had burned itself into the ground, pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat. Her team was scattered across the rubble, some unconscious, others groaning as they tried to regain their footing. Kane was nowhere to be seen. "Team, sound off!" Reyes shouted, her voice cutting through the eerie silence. One by one, the officers responded, their voices weak but alive. Reyes exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But her relief was short-lived. The fissure in the ground began to widen, the light emanating from it growing brighter. A low, guttural sound echoed from its depths, a sound that didn't belong in this world. Reyes's heart raced as she stared at the glowing rift, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. Dana, she said into her comms, her voice trembling slightly. Are you getting this? There was a pause before Dana's voice crackled through. Reyes. I don't know what I'm looking at. The energy readings are off the charts. Whatever that fissure is, it's not natural. No kidding, Reyes muttered, her eyes fixed on the rift. She turned to her team. Everyone, fall back. We're getting out of here now. The officers didn't need to be told twice. They began to move, helping each other over the rubble and toward the tunnel entrance. Reyes lingered for a moment, her gaze sweeping the chamber one last time. Kane was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As she turned to follow her team, the guttural sound from the rift grew louder, more insistent. Reyes glanced over her shoulder and froze. Something was emerging from the fissure, something massive, its form obscured by the blinding light. She couldn't make out its shape, but she could feel its presence, a primal, overwhelming force that made her blood run cold. Move, she shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. Go, go, go. The team broke into a sprint, the sound of the rift growing louder behind them. The ground shook violently, chunks of stone falling from the crumbling walls. Reyes pushed herself to keep up, her lungs burning as she ran. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the light from the rift casting long, flickering shadows that danced along the walls. When they finally emerged into the night air, Reyes collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. The others followed, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and terror. Behind them, the entrance to the tunnels caved in completely, sealing whatever was inside. For now. Reyes sat up slowly, her chest heaving as she looked back at the collapsed site. The swirling vortex in the sky was gone, but the oppressive energy lingered, a silent reminder of what they had witnessed. She pulled out her comm device, her hands shaking, and called Dana. It's done, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The artifact is gone. But Kane, he got away. Dana's voice was quiet. Reyes, what was that thing? I don't know, Reyes admitted, her gaze fixed on the ruins. But whatever it was, it's not over. She stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve unbroken. The silent ones were still out there, and Kane was still pulling the strings. Reyes didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing for sure, she wouldn't stop until the fight was finished, no matter what it cost her. The distant horizon remained unyielding, a dark smear against the faint glow of approaching dawn. Reyes stood at the edge of the ruined site, watching as the first responders and additional officers arrived to secure the area. She could hear the hum of their radios, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots, and the muted conversations as they tried to make sense of what had happened here. None of them could fully grasp it, not yet. Detective, one of the SWAT officers, Lewis, approached her, his face pale and drawn. We accounted for everyone on our team. Minor injuries, nothing critical. But, he hesitated, his gaze darting toward the collapsed tunnel behind them. Whatever was down there, it wasn't normal. Reyes nodded, her jaw tight. You don't have to tell me twice. What do we tell the brass? He asked, his voice low. They're going to want answers, and I don't think Paranormal Death Cult is going to cut it. Reyes took a deep breath, the weight of the question pressing down on her. What could she tell them? The truth? That the Silent Ones had tapped into forces beyond human understanding? That Kane had nearly succeeded in unleashing something that defied every law of nature? No one would believe her, not without evidence, and most of that had been buried beneath the rubble. We stick to what we can prove, she said finally, her tone firm. We tell them we disrupted a dangerous extremist group. That we recovered critical evidence of their operations, but are still assessing the full scope of their activities. Leave the rest out for now. Lewis hesitated but eventually nodded. Understood. As he walked away, Reyes turned her attention to Dana, who was pacing near one of the vehicles, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. Reyes approached, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. What do we have, Dana? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dana looked up, her face a mix of exhaustion and unease. I'm still processing everything, but the energy readings from the artifact, they weren't just abnormal, they were impossible. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some ancient relic. It was a portal, or a power source, or, she shook her head, struggling to find the right words. Honestly, I don't know. But whatever Kane was trying to do, it wasn't just symbolic. It was real. Reyes crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the collapsed tunnel in the distance. And now it's gone. The artifact, the rift, everything. Dana hesitated. Maybe. But, Reyes. I don't think we stopped it. Reyes turned to her, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Dana held up her tablet, pointing to a series of erratic energy spikes on the screen. These readings, this pattern, it's still happening. Whatever was activated down there, it didn't stop when the artifact was destroyed. It's like, it's spreading. Reyes felt a chill run down her spine. Spreading? How? I don't know, Dana admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. But I've been monitoring similar energy signatures across the city and beyond. Small, subtle fluctuations, but they're there. It's like the artifact wasn't the source, it was just the catalyst. Reyes' stomach sank. Kane's words echoed in her mind, you've only accelerated the inevitable. So this isn't over, she said quietly. Dana shook her head. No. It's just beginning. By the time Reyes made it back to the precinct, the sun had risen, casting a pale, washed-out light over the city. The events of the night felt surreal, like a half-remembered nightmare, but the exhaustion in her body and the ringing in her ears reminded her it had been all too real. The bullpen was unusually quiet as she walked in, her boots scuffing softly against the floor. Most of her team was still out in the field, processing evidence and securing the detainees from the estate. A few officers glanced up as she passed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern, but no one stopped her. She entered the briefing room, where a large corkboard was covered in photographs, maps, and notes about the Silent Ones. At the center of it all was a grainy image of Alistair Kane, his piercing eyes staring back at her like a challenge. Reyes sank into a chair, her head in her hands. The weight of it all threatened to crush her. Kane was still out there, and whatever the artifact had unleashed was spreading, maybe even beyond her city. The Silent Ones weren't just a local cult, they were part of something much bigger, something that had been building for centuries. And she had no idea how to stop it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and answered without looking at the caller ID. Reyes. Detective, it's Dana, came the familiar voice. You need to see this. What now? Reyes asked, her tone weary. I've been digging into the Silent One's communications, Dana said, her voice urgent. There's a pattern in their messages, a series of coordinates. I thought it was random at first, but now I'm not so sure. Reyes sat up straighter. Coordinates for what? I'm still piecing it together, but I think they're locations for other artifacts, Dana said. Or sites connected to the same energy signature we saw at the industrial complex. And one of them, it's here. In the city. Reyes felt her pulse quicken. Where? An abandoned cathedral on the south side, Dana replied. It's been empty for decades, but according to city records, it was purchased a year ago by a shell corporation tied to the Silent Ones. Reyes stood, her exhaustion forgotten. Send me the address. I'm heading there now. Reyes, wait, Dana said quickly. You can't go alone. We don't know what's there. It could be another trap, or worse. I'm not waiting around while Kane makes his next move, Reyes said, grabbing her coat. Get me back up, but I'm not waiting for them to catch up. Dana sighed, exasperated. Fine. But be careful. If this site is anything like the last one. I know, Reyes interrupted. I'll call you when I get there. She hung up and strode out of the precinct, her determination hardening with every step. If the Silent Ones had another site in the city, she needed to shut it down before it became another convergence point. The cathedral loomed before her like a forgotten relic, its once grand facade crumbling with age. Vines climbed its walls, and shattered stained glass windows stared back at her like hollow eyes. The air around the building felt heavy, suffused with an unnatural stillness that made her skin prickle. Reyes parked her car a block away and approached on foot, her hand resting on her holstered firearm. She glanced at her phone, checking the coordinates Dana had sent her. This was the place. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, which groaned loudly in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dark, the faint light from the broken windows casting long shadows across the dusty pews. The air smelled of damp stone and decay. As she moved deeper into the cathedral, the sense of wrongness grew stronger. The spiral eye symbol was etched into the walls, and faint whispers seemed to echo through the empty space, though she couldn't tell where they were coming from. At the far end of the nave, where the altar once stood, she saw it, a pedestal, and on it, another artifact. This one was smaller than the first, but its surface glowed faintly, the same pulsating rhythm that had haunted her since the industrial site. Reyes's heart pounded as she approached, her weapon drawn. She didn't know what this artifact was capable of, but she wasn't going to let it fall into the wrong hands. And then she heard it, a voice, low and familiar, coming from the shadows. "You're persistent, detective. I'll give you that." Reyes spun around, her weapon trained on the source of the voice. Kane stepped out of the darkness, his expression calm, almost amused. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone carrying a hint of warning. Reyes steadied her aim, her finger resting on the trigger. "And you shouldn't have underestimated me." Kane smiled faintly. "Oh, I haven't. In fact, I've been expecting you." Before she could respond, the artifact behind her began to glow brighter, its light casting the room in an ominous red hue. Kane's smile widened, and Reyes realized too late that she had walked straight into his trap. The artifact's glow intensified, filling the cathedral with an unnatural light that seemed to sap the air from Reyes's lungs. The whispers around her grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of incomprehensible voices that clawed at her sanity. She turned her head briefly toward the artifact, its pulsating rhythm now erratic, as if it were alive and angry. "Kane," she shouted, her voice trembling but firm. "Step away from the artifact. Whatever you're trying to do, it ends here." But Kane didn't move. He stood at the edge of the light, watching as the artifact's energy expanded outward, his presence disturbingly calm. "Don't you see, detective?" he said, his voice low but carrying easily over the chaos. "It's already far beyond your control. Beyond mine. The Silent Ones were never the architects of this. We're merely the messengers, the hands delivering what has always been inevitable." Reyes tightened her grip on her weapon, her breathing shallow. "You're insane." "Am I?" Kane replied, tilting his head slightly. The red glow of the artifact reflected in his eyes, making them look inhuman. "Or am I the only one who understands the truth? You felt it, haven't you? The weight of it. The pull. Even now, it calls to you." Reyes shook her head, taking a step forward. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care. You're coming with me, Kane, or I'll put you down right here." For the first time, Kane's calm demeanor cracked. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed through the cathedral. "Do you really think this is about me, detective? Killing me won't change anything. The door is open now. The Silent Ones were just the first to step through, but soon, the rest will follow. And you? You'll be left standing in the ruins." Reyes didn't hesitate. She fired. The shot echoed sharply through the cathedral, cutting through the sound of the whispers. The bullet hit Kane in the shoulder, spinning him backward. He staggered but didn't fall, his hand clutching the wound as he straightened. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his dark coat. Reyes advanced, her weapon still trained on him. "Stay down," she barked. "This is your last chance." But Kane only smiled, his teeth red with blood. You still don't understand, he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. It's not about me. It's about you. Before Reyes could process his words, the artifact let out a deafening, inhuman sound, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The light exploded outward, blinding her. She threw her arm up to shield her eyes, but it was too late. The force of the blast hit her like a sledgehammer, throwing her backward and slamming her into one of the crumbling pews. When the light finally dimmed, Reyes forced herself to sit up, her vision swimming. The artifact was no longer on the pedestal. In its place was a swirling, black void, its edges lined with jagged tendrils of energy. The air around it crackled and twisted, distorting reality itself. Kane stood at the edge of the void, his wounded arm hanging limply at his side, his face illuminated by its unholy glow. "This is it, detective," he said, his voice reverent. "The threshold. The point where one world ends and another begins." Reyes struggled to her feet, her weapon still in her hand, though her grip was weak. "You think this is the future," she spat, her voice raw. "This isn't salvation, Kane. It's annihilation." Kane turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "But it's not our choice to make." And then he stepped into the void. "No!" Reyes shouted, running toward him, but the tendrils of energy lashed out, forcing her back. She could only watch as Kane disappeared, his body swallowed by the darkness. The void pulsed violently, its energy growing more unstable by the second. The cathedral walls began to crack and crumble, the entire structure shaking as if the earth itself were rejecting whatever was happening here. Reyes's instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the void. It was expanding now, its edges consuming the pedestal, the altar, the floor beneath it. She could feel its pull, a gravitational force that seemed to reach for her, clawing at her very being. "Reyes!" Dana's voice crackled through her earpiece, frantic. "Get out of there. The energy readings are spiking, it's going to collapse." Reyes turned and ran, her boots pounding against the stone floor. The cathedral was falling apart around her, chunks of the ceiling crashing to the ground. The whispers had become a deafening roar, 1,000 voices screaming in unison. She reached the doors and threw herself through them just as the ground gave way beneath her. The explosion that followed wasn't fire or sound, it was silence. A silence so profound it seemed to erase everything around it. Reyes hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the sky as the cathedral imploded, collapsing into itself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The ruin smoldered in the early morning light, the swirling void now gone. Reyes lay still, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her ears rang, her body ached, and her mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. But one thing was clear, Kane was gone, and so was the artifact. Or so she thought. As she sat up, her eyes caught something glinting in the rubble. She crawled toward it, her hands shaking as she lifted it from the debris. It was a fragment of the artifact, no larger than her palm, its surface still faintly glowing. She stared at it, her heart sinking. The whispers were still there, faint but unmistakable. And then she heard Kane's voice, distant but clear, as if carried on the wind. "This is only the beginning, detective. You've opened the door. Now you have to live with what comes through." Reyes closed her eyes, clutching the fragment tightly. For the first time in her career, she felt truly helpless. The Silent Ones were gone, the artifact destroyed, but the darkness they had unleashed was still out there. And it was only a matter of time before it found its way back. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.